Hey, welcome to another episode of an ongoing series where we basically take the camera anywhere we want to try to find secrets and new discoveries to some of our favorite games, and this time around we're covering Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, which I'm super excited about. Before this, we only covered Grand Theft Auto 5, so taking a look at this one before we move on to 3 and Vice City is going to be a ton of fun. Rockstar Games does a whole bunch of wacky stuff with their cutscenes, and since the environment's so huge and it was a bit of the Wild West for open sandbox games, you could bet yourself that there's going to be some interesting stuff to find. So with that said, let's take a look. The first one we're going to be talking about is OG Loke, and he's got a couple of things going on, but the thing I want to open up this episode with is the fact that the dude has burgers for brains. And I mean that literally. If you take the camera inside of his burger hat, surprising is that you can still see his bandana on the texture, but beyond that, like I said, it's burger texture. And what I find very special about this is that it all comes to a point in a way that it looks like the top of his head is the eye of Sauron. And we'll get back to Loke in a second, but first, I want to talk about this police officer who's hanging upside down from this vent, because taking the camera out of bounds can show you that he's doing a spread eagle in order to keep himself up there, which is pretty fantastic. And also, it gives you an idea of how they force the perspective of a dark void if you were to look inside the vent. It seems to be a triangular prism that all comes to a point because it saves on resources to use that few tries, and still effectively tells the player that, hey, there could be anything in there. And now let's talk about the possessed burger trays. In this cutscene of OG Loke, you can see something that's already a little bit ominous outside the boundaries as his co-worker walks out of frame and his character model seems to disappear, leaving the tray behind. The fact is, the co-worker did not disappear, but in fact, he's hidden underneath the boundaries. But oddly enough, his dinner tray seems to be tied to some animation that we can't see on the character model. And so it starts moving around independently as if it's being moved by a ghost. Even stranger than that is that well outside the boundaries is another burger tray that is going absolutely wacky tobacky. And I'm pretty sure this burger tray is attached to OG Loke. And the distance between the character model in the cutscene versus where the burger tray is to stay out of sight has been put at such a distance that the burger tray just moves wildly, making it very, very hard to keep track of. Then we got this scene with the green saber, and one of the police officers is supposed to be in the driver's seat backing the vehicle up. But as you can see, outside of the player's view, the police officer is initially in the driver's seat, and then as the vehicle backs up, the animation is not tied to it whatsoever. And to compensate for that, the character model constantly zips into the driver's seat over and over until it functions properly in the player's view. Also, here's the 2 characters that were in the cutscene shown to you earlier, stored out of bounds. And now it's time to show some of you guys some seriously cursed character model distortion. Once this cutscene wraps up, the CJ model gets stored over here for whatever reason, and his model gets pinched and pulled in so many weird directions, along with these beer bottles that seem to get stored here as well. It is truly horrifying. But that's not the only time that happens in this game. One of the weirdest ones that I've seen is when you're reintroduced to Claude from Grand Theft Auto 3, and when that cutscene ends, all the cars that were in the cutscene seem to jump into the air, get completely dismantled, and also leave a dev cube for each vehicle. Also, speaking of dev cubes, one of the weirdest ones that I found was in this cutscene where the characters open up the fridge door. Now, I made a point to look at this fridge because you don't normally get to open up fridges in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. And also, in this cutscene, the contents of the fridge are completely unseen by the player. So it's really funny that all that's actually inside is a singular dev cube that probably tells the door to open and shut. And now, seriously, just for fun, I wanted to match up the map of the game with the actual environment of the game. I don't know if that brings as much entertainment to you as it does for me, but just looking at this map constantly for hours at a time just to get through this game, it was kind of satisfying for me, at least, to see the literal environment look one-to-one with what I've had to look in the pause menu this whole time. Now we're going to take a minute to talk about today's sponsor, War Thunder. When it comes to vehicle combat games, War Thunder is the most involved one that you will ever find on the market. Is 2 tanks, 12 planes, 4 helicopters, and 5 ships not enough vehicles for you? Well, get a load of this. War Thunder has 2,000 to choose from between all 4 vehicles, and all 4 can compete in a dynamic PvP style battle. And if you're a stickler for graphics, this game will not disappoint you. Every single vehicle is modeled down to their individual components, meaning that every single vehicle that you unlock is incredibly detailed, which was something that was super important to the developers to give you an immersive combat experience. One of the amazing features that this game has is an in-depth customization system where you can stylize your vehicle with camouflages, markings with historical significance, as well as 3D decorations like bushes or other equipment, which is all very impressive for a game that has a collection of vehicles that spans over 100 years, from the 1920s to the present day. And for you gamers that have a stickler for resolution, the game does display in 4K and has authentic sound effects, as well as music that is tailored to an atmosphere to fully immerse yourself in. Also, don't worry about buying any expensive hardware. The game plays beautifully with a mouse and keyboard, allowing you to effortlessly fly planes with a mouse aim. One of the things I personally love about War Thunder is the vehicle damage. For a PvP game, you wouldn't expect individual parts to fly off of a tank, but not only is it just the tanks, but so many of the other vehicles that are available in the game. It's kind of incredible. Also, to celebrate the new year in 2024, all players can also claim 3 exclusive festive decals based on the Gaijin Snail, Elf, Rudolph, and Grinch to decorate their vehicles with all the way until the end of January. All new players, as well as players that haven't played in the last 6 months across all platforms, can claim a large bonus pack by clicking my link. The pack includes multiple premium vehicles, a premium account, and an exclusive 3D decorator for your vehicles, and so much more. All is available for a limited time only, so act very fast. Thanks again, War Thunder, for sponsoring this episode, and with that said, let's get back to it. And now let's talk about the opening scene of the game. So first, the game starts in Liberty City Airport and moves on to Los Santos Airport. And there's a lot of things I want to talk about in this scene, but the first one I really want to get into is this unused animation of a luggage being picked up at the airport. Now, I was very ready to just write this off as an animation of the luggage being picked up by CJ being put on repeat, thinking that this model is tied to a trigger that isn't dependent on CJ. But I took a closer look at it by having the camera in this exact spot and then layering these 2 clips over one another for when CJ picks up his luggage versus the luggage that gets picked up afterwards. And as you can see, the animation for the 2 pieces of luggage are completely different. They go in different paths entirely, meaning that probably in this scene at one point, there was supposed to be a lot more people at the airport, and that this luggage was supposed to be picked up by another NPC. Moving on from that though, let's take a look around. These scenes are incredibly brief with a very restricted camera, and so a lot of this you don't get to see. Like over here it says international departures, as well as toilets. But the single most interesting thing is what's on these monitors here, which appear to share the same texture as the order monitors from Burger Shot. As you can see, it says double deluxe with the Buster with a total of $20 cash, making for one very elaborate restaurant. That's so stupid. This is always a cool byproduct of the PlayStation 2 era where everything was still in standard definition. If you have the camera pulled back far enough, you would never be able to see anything like this. Anyways, moving the camera over to the arrivals, you can see the name of various locations such as Liberty City, Vice City, Center City, Leith INT, Tokyo, and Johnson. Also, CJ gets picked up from the outside of the airport, and once the cutscene is completely wrapped up, the taxi cab is stored where you first see CJ and the flight attendant, and the flight attendant's model gets completely distorted. This one was a little bit harder to get a shot of because if you move the camera a little too close to it, the whole model just sort of disappears for a moment. However, zooming in on this shot here can give you a really solid idea of where this person's body starts and ends. Now I want to talk about some character models, and first we're going to do Ryder here. The field model for Ryder has no eyes. You take the camera past his shades and you can see that his eyes are closed, and this is the most hilarious. I have to share this, I'm so sorry, but when grabbing this clip, I swear to God, this NPC in the background says this:
"These Santos bitches can't see me."
How appropriate. So anyways, that's not to say that Ryder's blind or anything. In cutscenes in the game, you can see that the model is a little bit more higher poly. And taking the camera past his shades here can show you that his eyes are open and that they even have modeling for the eyeballs. Speaking of which, let's take a look inside of CJ's head as well, showing you how his eye shapes work. They're not full 3D spheres. Grand Theft Auto San Andreas likes to work with those half spheres, which can save a bit on resources. One of the coolest things I will just say right now is Grand Theft Auto San Andreas is a fascinating game because of how massive it is, but what the 3D modelers had to do in order to make this work on a PlayStation 2 hardware. Sometimes you get Nintendo 64 levels of quality to the models and stuff like that. It's honestly super freaking cool. And speaking of how the world works in San Andreas, taking the camera out of bounds during an interior part of the game, you may find a completely different room out in the void. This is because all of the interior shots are sort of like lined up together and then culled out for the most part. And you could see remnants of other rooms that are clearly culled out by the items that they they hold. So in this clip I'm showing you, you can see tons of body armor and shotguns. And this is likely because the developers did not go through the trouble of having a culling trigger for items that you'd be picking up in these interior scenes. But if you want a better idea of what it looks like if all the interior shots were loaded in at once, we can get an idea of what that would look like thanks to a map editor made by Tony Robleski. Thank you, Tony. It's also thanks to Tony that I can also tell you where these stand in the entire game world. It turns out all the interior rooms are resting above the map. So while they are obviously culled out, because if you looked up in the sky, you won't see a bunch of random cubes. If everything was shown to you all at once, you'd see that the outside world is down below and literally everything else in the game is resting above. Anyways, moving on, let's talk about Ryder's house here. It looks like there's this unused area that can be seen at glimpses. However, I don't think they ever utilized this room as a scene in any of the cutscenes of the game. This is Ryder's living room, and in it, there is a poster of Grand Theft Auto Vice City. And that's one of the most interesting things. It definitely stands out against a otherwise normal looking living room, but they really went all out with this room. There's like a ton of photos, coffee tables, bookshelves, so much more. It's really surprising that I don't think you ever get a chance to see all this. Anyways, moving on from there, let's start talking about characters that are just hidden out of bounds. A lot of the time in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, character models are kind of pushed underneath the map only to be called into a cutscene later, and many of them end up having a T-pose like this officer here. And in rare moments like this very same cutscene, the developers might be brave enough to even put a T-posed character in the scene itself, like CJ here. But one of the coolest things about the cutscenes in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas is that the player character is not the same as the cutscene character for CJ. So at any given time, when you're watching a cutscene in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, the player CJ is probably hidden somewhere else on the map. Like in this scene when you're first introduced to Loke, you can find the player CJ hidden behind this purple structure. And if we zoom it out, you can see the player CJ and the cutscene CJ all in one shot. And then we got the first introduction of Big Smoke. His character model is also stored out of bounds just below the kitchen. But the object that he uses in this cutscene, which is a bat, is stored inside the scene. But you can see how the bat is tied to the character model, as for whatever reason, when the bat is getting ready to move into scene, you can see Big Smoke's arms sort of move with the bat.
You picked the wrong house, fool!
Hey, Big Smoke! It's me, Carl! Chill!
CJ?
Now let's talk about what happens when CJ gets some cosmetic changes in the game. For example, going into his closet and changing out something like, say, his shirt can show you that he's standing in place with his original outfit, and then the second that the model is swapped out with new clothing, the character model is already immediately in an animation that's in the process of opening the changing door. Also at the barber shops, obviously the barber gets in the way of the camera, so you don't get to see the exact moment in which something like facial hair gets added to the character. But in this case, the facial hair change happens very, very quickly, and the cover up for it hangs in place for a bit longer to give the immersion that he's actually clipping the hair in some way. And like you guys might remember, we talked about interior scenes versus exterior scenes in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, and in most cases there's just a black void outside of any interior shots. But for this one cutscene with the garage that CJ gets from Claude, you can see that there's a lot more exterior than there normally is in any one of these scenes. You can see a couple of those construction pods, as well as some cranes in the background and everything else. And I believe it's 1-for-1. It may even be the actual outside world, just with the rest of it unloaded, because this is what it would look like if you were outside of the garage. Also want to take the camera up to the CJ D500, the latest cutting edge console with only 4 buttons. Those 4 buttons being CJMD, which I think is a pretty obvious connection to Carl Johnson, the game's main character, with the other 2 letters possibly being connected to Mad Dog, but it's far more likely that it's just a random set of extra letters to give it 4 buttons. Now let's talk about low poly models in the environment. This is really fun. I could have dragged out this video super hard with a whole bunch of these, but maybe I'll save some extras for a part 2 in the future. But for now, here's the area with the boardwalk that has its own Ferris wheel. And right now you're looking at the low poly version. And what would you guess that this object is right here? It almost looks like an outline of a spaceship or something. Well, if we drop CJ into the environment, we could see all this become high poly modeled. And what was once a paper cutout of a spaceship now becomes the Yacht Harbor Sports Fishing Boating Cafe sign. And those buildings that we were looking at a second ago, here's how they're all supposed to look like. But none of that compares to the burger shot spinning object. The low poly version is it looks more like sloppy joes than a burger to me, I'll say. That's still giving it too much credit, because I mean, honestly, it doesn't even look like a sandwich at this point. And like I said, dropping CJ in can show you the entire building in its high poly glory, revealing a double cheeseburger with a layer of mayo on the bottom, a slice of tomato on top, along with a nice fresh pear of lettuce. And then we got this cutscene here where CJ goes into the cabin and makes some hot coffee. And I don't think any of us expected there to be anything YouTube unsafe, I guess. But what's really cool is that there's a black prism that CJ goes into and stays in there for the entirety of the cutscene. And lastly, here's an unrelated blooper that I wanted to share with you guys because it made me giggle when I saw it. And thank you again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. You can play War Thunder now for free using the link in the pinned comment in the video description to also get the bonus pack as well as the Festive Snail decals. And make sure you act fast because you will not be disappointed. And on top of that, if you want to help out the show in other ways, links to the Patreon and YouTube membership is down below. Thank you so much, and I'll see you again soon.